real in the sense that these kind of things, these kind of behaviors do happen, disturbing as they are. Are you muted? I'm muted. There we go. All right. So this very real man, yes, these behaviors happen. Yes, they are disturbing. Yes, they are distressing. And the fear of them is real too, is it not? Now, some of you may be fortunate enough not to have seen anyone acting in a similar way to him. At the state hospital, I've seen it a few times. Yeah, it happens. And it is distressing, even if you work with it every day and a lot. You know, when you see someone disrobing or whatever they're doing, it can be a distressing thing. And so this is real, and he's real. And sometimes, of course, he can be a she. But I mean, I remember having this figure in my head, and I think it's also a kind of archetype that we carry in our heads and in our hearts. I remember going to youth camp at Camp Aldersgate in Ohio, and there's a group of us, and it's dark, it's night, and the fire is flickering, but the lights are out. And there's my youth counselor, George Gruss, who told me the story for the first time of the man with the stainless steel hook. Anybody hear that in camp or similar? The homicidal maniac, this frightening figure with the hook, and he was, of course, hiding out in the woods, just ready to catch an unwary camper. So you better watch out or he'll get you. The stigma is real, the stereotypes are real, and there are people who are, you know, homicide. Our maximum security hospital up in Vernon, we have some very dangerous people up there, and if they're found legally to be, quote, manifestly dangerous, they do go up to Vernon, and they've got a very good program up there, work program and so on, and they'll spend some time up there with, you know, the staff that knows what they're doing, and they have a work program, and then they come back to us at the state hospital when they're not manifestly dangerous anymore. So yes, that is out there, but I also hasten to add that most people with mental health issues are not violent. In fact, they are more likely to be the victim of a crime than the perpetrator. So that's a good thing to keep in mind. Most of them are just in a very vulnerable kind of state, and they're more likely to be victimized. But the fear is there. The stigma is there. And what most of us are thinking about is, you know, how about, you know, prevention? How can we be really, really serious about prevention so that the Gerasene man who lived in the tombs, it's a picture of living death, isn't it? And didn't wear clothes and was unable to live in a house. Well, people, I've seen him on I-35 and her. Yeah. How do we prevent that? How do we minimize that from happening? And I'm glad to be here with a group like you that so loves social justice. Because social justice is mental health promotion. It's what we call salutogenic as opposed to pathogenic. Affordable housing is mental health care. A strong economy that works for everyone is good mental health care. You can make a good living and support your family and grow up in a safe school with a good educational system, and there's parental leave available and affordable child care. You know, all the things that we care about so passionately in this congregation. So, whether or not you ever do anything directly in mental health care, and you know, there's a minority of us that do, if you're involved in social justice and just basic acts of kindness and compassion, you're in the recovery movement too. That counts. It counts big time. But yes, it is out there, and the fear is real, and it's difficult to talk about, especially in most churches. You noticed in prayer time, we'll pray for cancer and heart attack and so on. That's respectable, but very few people will raise up and say, you know, my uncle's struggling with depression, or somebody's got schizophrenia. That doesn't often get prayed about. Yeah, the stigma is there. I'm glad that seems to be an exception here, and I'm glad to see that in the litany we'll be saying later they talk about trauma. I'll be talking about that too. that we can name that here, that we can mention that here, because 1 Texan in every 3 has a mental health issue. 1 in 3. So that means there's some of you in the room, and don't worry, I'm not going to take a poll. I'm nice that way. 1 in every 3 Texans has an issue with that. So if you are not struggling with it, or have not ever struggled with it, you know someone who does. You've got a family member, you've got a friend that you're likely worried about. I still get calls from people in the Methodist system, especially clergy who can't risk too much in church, and they will call me and say, I'm scared to death about my teenage son or daughter or my grandchild because, you know, they've run away, they've, you know, they're out of control, they're in a hospital, and I'm terrified. And so I sometimes still get calls like that, even though I've been out of the system for a very long time, because they know I've got resources. So yeah, the fear of that is incredibly real. Fortunately, so is recovery. Recovery is real too. And how does that all work? Well, I think it helps maybe to unpack a little bit and increase our understanding of how, you know, how the things like the Gerasene man work. And of course, in those days, you had an agrarian society with very harsh income inequality. In those days, income inequality happened, right? And so, when you have that, you have a lot of belief in demons. So that contexts the story. You know, they have a lot of belief in demons and forces of evil and spirits and the devil and so on. And it's very pronounced when there's very harsh economic conditions. Would it happen today? To think about that. Yeah, there's a pastor in Tennessee, he's got a deliverance ministry, got a huge mega church and does that, and one in West Virginia that a friend of mine's working with, and they're really into this exorcism. I can't prove to you that demons don't exist because I can't prove a negative. You know, there's no way I can prove that that's not real. And you know, maybe some people believe that. That's not my personal belief system, that's all I'll say. But some people, you know, that is very real, and you can see, or I can see at least, how if you're living in very harsh conditions and struggling to survive, and you see just a tiny elite making all the money and getting all the wealth of the land, and you are just barely getting by, forces of evil would be very real to you. And a way to talk about it and tell stories about it and personify it would be a need. So this exorcism, it's more than just telling a demon to get out or whatever. It's speaking to a system too. Yeah, so these are very tied in. Social justice, mental health, very, very intertwined. So I said before, recovery is real, and I want to unpack a little what it looks like, and hopefully here also you'll get some news you can use. So maybe my hope is it's not just a sermon, but it's got some things in it that are also useful today. At the state hospital, we have a group of people who have had mental health diagnoses and have walked their journey and have experienced recovery, and they are called peer supporters. They work with the team of psychologists and psychiatrists and social workers and so on as peers. And they listen to the people talk about their issues, and they share what's called a recovery story, which has 3 parts. You tell your illness story, what happened to you. You talk about a turning point. Well, you know, I realized that, you know, that I had to get a good therapist, or I got research, something happened, and since then, this is my recovery, and this is how life has been great since. Most recovery stories are relatively brief, especially the illness part, but they're incredibly powerful. You know, you hear a recovery story, and suddenly this person who thinks they're in the darkest hole ever and nobody understands is hearing from someone who's been there. And if you say, well, it sounds like Alcoholics Anonymous or something, yeah, you're right, it's very similar. But they're saying, this is the pathway I walked. It's also very democratic because you're not telling the person they have to do exactly what you did, but you're saying, well, these are some things that worked for me. I have some other resources of things that have worked for other people. But the person you're talking to is always in the driver's seat. But they have resources they didn't have before. So they share the recovery story, they share resources, they help the person get connected in the community that they're going to be going to after they've been in the hospital. And they talk about another thing too, and that's the taproot that drives mental illness. That same taproot also drives substance use disorders, you know, abuse of alcohol, other drugs. It also drives legal involvement, jail and prison involvement. And it also drives a lot of early deaths from things like cancer and heart attack and diabetes and stroke. And that taproot is trauma, childhood trauma. We have learned at the hospital not to so much say what's wrong with you as to say what happened to you. Because the people there, and not just at the state hospital, but out there, you know, many times are people that horrendous things have happened to. You know, what kind of things? Now, you know, childhood trauma, I'm not talking about failing a test or getting a bad grade or not making a sports team. A trauma is an event that is, an adverse event that is so overwhelming that it overwhelms your ability to cope. What counts are things like physical abuse, sexual abuse, emotional abuse, neglect. You don't know where your next meal is coming from. You're dirty because your caregiver is ignoring you. That counts. Divorced parents, that counts. Witnessing domestic violence, that counts too. Parent in prison counts. You know, those types of things, very, very adverse events that a child's not going to be able to cope with. And they did a study about all this. Some of you may have heard of it. It's called the ACEs study. Adverse Childhood Experience, ACE. They did the study on a relatively affluent population at Kaiser Permanente. So all these people had health insurance. They were middle, upper middle class, 70% white. And they gave them a questionnaire. It's called the ACEs questionnaire. And they said, were you physically abused? Yes or no, before age 18. Sexually abused, emotionally abused. Did your parents divorce? Did this happen? 10 things. Yes, no, yes, no, yes, no. And what they found was striking. Out of that entire huge, thousands of people they gave to that questionnaire to, 67% had at least one ACE. ACEs are surprisingly common. And 12% had 4 or more ACEs. And as you might guess, they were the ones that had these really, you know, terrible health outcomes. The more, it's a dose, if you know medicalese, dose-response relationship. That means the more ACEs you have, the more issues you're going to have. Okay. And peer supporters are the ones, well, others too now, clinicians know about this stuff. They're the ones informing about trauma and educating and helping people deal with the trauma. Because if you deal with the trauma, or better yet, prevent it in the first place, social justice, you can bring the number of ACEs down. This is why I keep telling you, if you're doing social justice work, you're in this recovery movement, whether you ever do anything else or not. So it's ACEs. And before the age of 18 is key because that's when the cells of the body are in a vulnerable state of development. So, you know, there's some damage that gets done. Good news is that can be healed. And we know a lot about what to do about it now. I love the work of Dr. Bessel van der Kolk. He's been doing trauma for 50 years. So I'll give you some ideas about what does work. A lot of it is nonverbal. Interesting factoid. Trauma takes place in a part of the brain that does not have language. Therefore, a lot of what we do is nonverbal. Eye movement, EMDR, if you've ever heard of that. The brain is neurologically tied to the eyeballs. If you bring up the memory of the trauma and move your eyeballs a certain way, it can help rearrange the trauma so that you're not thinking that the trauma is always happening now. Right? Does that make sense? Because, you know, like a veteran come back from the armed forces, to their brain, they think they're still in combat. So they go into New York City and a car backfires and they're right down on the ground. Because the brain can't say, oh, that happened a long time ago. Okay. And of course, there's at least as much post-traumatic stress in the general population as there is in the veteran population. So there's EMDR, nonverbal movement helps, some of the others. Neurofeedback, where you learn to manage your thoughts and you get little rewards when you're calm. That's another method. Mindfulness meditation. I've learned how to do that. That's also it's self-management. People in societies that, haven't had sophisticated mental health care, they know about this. Learning to manage the self. Yoga. Yoga classes are incredibly popular where I work. A lot of our clients find them very helpful. And of course, psychotherapy and some other things. So we've got the peer supporters and our clinicians, and we're addressing trauma, because if you address trauma, you address a whole lot of other problems at the same time. My friend Sarah, over 80 years old, came to me once. She says, I am so tired of living with the memory of what happened to me when I was 6. She says, I just can't get rid of it. I hate it. And I said, well, I have some resources for that. I got a friend who's a therapist. You want to go see her? And she did. Cut a long story short, within a few months, she came to me and said, the most wonderful thing's happening. I still remember what happened to me, but it's like it's old news. That was a long time ago. And finally, the brain could say that, could really understand that. Because she did some EMDR, and my therapist friend Donna did a thing called tapping, which has to do with rhythm. We're very rhythmic creatures. Rhythm can be very healing. Theater and movement is another technique. Acting in a play. There's something about that. In one town in England, if a boy gets arrested for juvenile delinquency, and that by now we know that's abuse and neglect, probably. There's something about him playing a king or a prince in a play. He gets sentenced to be a Shakespearean actor, and he plays the king or the prince in the Shakespeare play in this small town, and it's magical. So, I know all of this from people I've worked with and people I've talked to and people I've helped. And, yeah, I too am a trauma survivor. My father was an alcoholic and had terrible depression. My mother was emotionally abusive. So I have walked this path. But I'm happy to tell you that I get to participate in this exorcism ministry of Jesus in a way because of that. Because what we learn from this story that is still true today is that people who face their own demons, whatever they might be, are in a great position to help other people with similar demons to cast out theirs. So for me, that looks like doing this kind of work. It looks like helping a friend. Very recently, I had dinner, a few months back with a friend who I wasn't even sure I could call a friend anymore because she'd stood me up so many times. And I finally lost my temper, and I said, look, if you wanted to do things with me, you would, and you keep canceling, and I don't get it. And it would always be I have a headache, or, I've just decided not to come. And finally, what are we going to do? But I meet with her. And she starts talking about how bad she sometimes feels. And a light bulb went on, and I said, that time when you didn't come to my party, was that depression? And she said, I couldn't get out of bed. I was paralyzed. I couldn't move. I couldn't get in the car. So what did I do? I mean, now that I understood, I had a whole lot more compassion. And I did my recovery story. Well, I had an alcoholic father, and my mother was emotionally mean to me, and she looks at me and goes, I said, well, I had a very good therapist, and I got some resources, and I learned to meditate, and I did those things, and I know some other things. I said, would you like me to send you some resources? And she said, please do. So, yeah. So I just want you to know before I wrap this up, yes, I have resources. If you have someone you're worried about, someone that might want to face their depression demon or whatever, as a quick aside, I love it. My name is Legion, for we are many. Boy, is that a good description of depression. You know, the demon of hopelessness, the demon of sadness. It can be, people think depression is sadness. It's a lot more. Social anxiety, you know, being afraid of people, not being able to get out of bed, not sleeping well, not eating well, or eating everything in the house. It is, you know, when I had depression, my name was Legion. Ugh, yeah. But recovery is real, people. If you're doing social justice, if you're doing acts of kindness, you're part of it. It counts. I'm part of it. The movement is us. We are all in this together. Amen. In the litany of naming, starts on one page and flips to the second page. I'll read the leader part and you can respond with the bold part. On this Mental Health Sunday, we join in this litany of naming. As a congregation, we are glad to lift up our voices and our spirits to break the silence that often happens when we are confronted with mental illness.